What do you see as the end game?
Well, the motive, of course, was implied in that comment by Maurice Strong. They want one world government. And that's why they wanted something that was global in its threat and argued that no one government could manage it.
Thank you for coming tonight. Our guest speaker is Dr. Timothy Ball, PhD. Dr. Ball has studied climate academically and scientifically for over 40 years, after spending 8 years studying meteorology and observing the weather as an aircrew and operations manager in the Canadian Air Force. Please welcome Dr. Timothy Ball, who along with author Mark Stein has had the experience of being sued by the infamous hockey stick wielder Michael Mann.
Thank you. Evening. Notice I didn't say good. That, of course, is the issue here. Is there a problem, and how do we define it? Okay, we're going to talk about human-caused global warming. Most people have no idea about the science at all, but they've got very definitive opinions about it. Human-caused global warming, of course, has become the central theme. And as I'll show you, it's all related to this idea that we shouldn't be on the planet at all. In the extreme environmental movement, a very strong anti-humanity theme. And I see coming back now those t-shirts and bumper stickers that were around for a while, save the planet, kill yourself. And to give you an idea of how extreme it's become, Prince Philip, they said to him, you know, if you could be reincarnated, what would you want to come back as? And he said, I'd want to come back as a deadly virus and kill off most of the people. That was a good idea, as long as they started with the monarchy. But the whole human-caused global warming, of course, is around the theme that everything that's wrong with the planet is being caused by humans. It is, without question, the biggest deception in history. You hear academics talking about a paradigm shift. What are they talking about? They're talking about a society deciding to look at something in a very different way than they have previously. The one, of course, that we're talking about tonight is environmentalism. And people say, oh, you don't care about the environment. I care more about the environment than anybody I know. I've served on commissions, and I've set up boards of soil conservation, water conservation, all sorts of attempts to deal with environmental issues. But what happened was a group of people grabbed it and used it to control everybody else. This is a simplified diagram of the weather, with the sunlight coming in at the top here and heat coming in from the oceans, and how it all gets mixed up. When you stand outside, you experience the weather. That is the sum total of everything from cosmic radiation in deep space to heat coming off the bottom of the oceans and everything in between. It is what engineers call a white noise. It's as if you were standing outside of a football stadium and you're 100,000 people. That's a white noise. And what they're trying to tell you is that we know enough about the climate and the weather to be able to pick out individual noises in that stadium. And I'm here to tell you we don't and we can't. They've picked out one of those individual noises, and I want you to think about this. They've chosen CO2. Why did that become the focus? It's such a minuscule part of the total atmosphere, as we'll see. So there must have been some reason that it became the focus of everything. And that's what we need to talk about here, what we need to understand. In the graph here, it's in with atmospheric composition. But that's only one gas in the atmosphere. There's nitrogen and oxygen, which are 98% of the atmosphere. And then there are what are called the greenhouse gases. And this is where the deception begins, because this shows you the greenhouse gas percentages. But look at this. Here's CO2, 4% of the greenhouse gases. What's the biggest greenhouse gas? The most important greenhouse gas is water vapor. It's 95%. You know that here. You go to Insula in southern Algeria in 1943, they recorded a temperature change. It was minus 3.6 at midnight, and by noon the next day it was plus 52 degrees Celsius. That is a phenomenal change of temperature. Why? Because there's no water vapor in the desert. The CO2 makes no difference whatsoever. But you see, this is what they wanted you to focus on, and that's the question we need to ask ourselves. There's that same pie chart. And this is right off of ABC News' website. This graph shows the distribution of greenhouse gases in Earth's atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is clearly the majority. It doesn't even show water vapor. 95% of what our greenhouse gases is left out of this graph. This is 100% wrong. And then you start to understand why the people are confused about what's going on, how easily they are misled. I wanted to get a graph that was long enough to cover everybody in the room. This is 420,000 years. This came out in 1991, and it was presented as proof that CO2 was driving temperature. And the blue line is the temperature, the red line is CO2. And they were saying, oh, this is proof. This is what these people that were using climate for a political agenda, they said this is proof that the temperature's driving, or CO2's driving temperature. We knew within 5 years that it showed exactly the opposite, that the temperature changes before the CO2 changes. But what's the whole fundamental assumption that they make? They say, oh, CO2 goes up, the temperature will go up. That doesn't occur in any record anywhere in the world at any time in history. So the fundamental assumption they make about CO2 and temperature is wrong. I'll show you another graph. 600 million years of the Earth's history. What this shows is the current level, CO2 is the red line. And here we are at the current level, 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And Al Gore tells you that's the highest level we've ever had. Look at this graph. It is in fact the lowest level we've ever had. You could argue, looking at here, the last 300 million years, that the CO2 level has averaged around 1,000 to 1,200 parts per million. 3 times what we've currently got. And do you know how we know that's important to the Earth? Because if you go to the greenhouse, the commercial greenhouses, they pump up to 1,200 parts per million of CO2 to get the plants to grow more vigorously. So you could argue, say, the plants are malnourished at 400 parts per million. Here's another interesting thing. Here's the temperature. The blue line is the temperature. This is the Ordovician Ice Age, 438 million years ago. An ice age. But what's the level of CO2? 4,000 parts per million. And they're telling you at 400 parts per million, we're in runaway potential of global warming. The evidence doesn't support anything that they're saying, but they still push that agenda. Climate change. The climate's always changed. Saying that the climate's changing is like saying women have babies. But of course, the public have no idea how much the climate changes, how dramatically and quickly the climate changes, and I'll show you that very briefly. So for example, in my short lifetime, from 1900 to 1940, the global temperature was going up. And then from 1940 to 1980, it went down. And from 1980 to 1998, it went up. And from 1998 to now, it's going down. 4 climate changes. I survived them all. And the lack of CO2 has nothing to do with my lack of hair. I like to tell people, you're looking at someone that would love to have a bad hair day. But here, this shows you that same ice core record from Antarctica. Here's the current temperature, and the temperature goes down to the ice age in here, and then up. So these peaks are what we call interglacials. You should be darn grateful we live in an interglacial. Canada's certainly grateful. It wouldn't have existed 20,000 years ago. And then again, remember what they're telling you. Oh, it's warmer than it's ever been. But look at the previous interglacials, how warm they were. And you go back to 120,000 years. Barney Rubble wasn't driving a car. It's got nothing to do with CO2. But what I want you to notice is look at how quickly the temperature rose, but how quickly it also drops. Look at the variability. That's about 40 degrees Fahrenheit or more of variability of temperature in each of those ups and downs. That's normal. But you've been led to believe that change is not normal. You're looking down on the North Pole. It's complicated by the fact that here, this is 18,000 years ago. Here's the massive Laurentide ice sheet covering most of Canada and northern US, the Greenland ice sheet, the Eurasian ice sheet. That's just 18,000 years ago. And here's the North American picture. Where did the water come from for all that ice? The answer is it came from out of the oceans. So 18,000 years ago, the oceans were 420 feet lower than they are today. This is 18,000 years ago, and you see the sea level, and look at the rapid rise in sea level in a period of about 6,000 years. Oh, they're telling Al Gore, oh, the sea level is going to rise, it's going to be the end of the world. You see from here about 15,000 years ago up to 8,000 years ago, that's when the dramatic increase in sea level. So 427 feet approximately. For the last 8,000 years, sea level has increased very, very slightly. And this is another problem. You see, they tell you, oh, you heard another story about Antarctica. Oh, it's going to melt and crash into the ocean. The sea level is going to rise. Hang on a minute. Remember the old grade 8 experiment when you put a glass of water and you put an ice cube in it? And what will happen when the ice cube melts? Most people think the water will spill out over the edge of the glass, and it's not right. Some will say, well, the water level will stay the same. They're not right either. In fact, the water level will go down. Because when water freezes into ice, it expands. The ice occupies more space than the water that formed it. So if the Antarctic and Greenland ice caps were to melt, most of them are already below sea level. So that, in fact, wouldn't affect sea level. In fact, it would cause a decline in sea level. If you're standing on the shore, like you're down in the Gulf of Mexico, Louisiana coastline there, you say, oh, the sea level's coming in. It's advancing in. Do you know what's happening there? The land is sinking. The land is sinking. Because you can stand on a shoreline, and if the sea level line is moving, you don't know if it's because the water's rising or falling or because the land's rising or falling. A place called Sloop's Cove, where the Hudson Bay Company used to tie up their sailing ships, is now above water even at high tide. And that's in just 200 years. This is a graph of about 10,000 years. This is from Greenland. This is ice core data, the temperature from Greenland over the last 10,000 years. Here's the current temperature over here. It's been warmer than the current temperature for most of the last 10,000 years. But again, they don't tell you that. This is a photograph that I got from Professor Ritchie from the University of Toronto. He's passed away now. But what it shows here, this is a white spruce, Picea glauca, and it's radiocarbon dated at around 4,940 years old. And yet it's 100 kilometers north of the current tree line. To have a tree grow to that dimension in that latitude, the temperature has to be 2 to 3 degrees warmer than currently. All right? And they're saying, oh, 2 to 3 degrees warmer is going to be the end of the world. How did the polar bear survive this? Well, we'll look at that question because, of course, that's one of the things that they want to play on people's emotions with. Extinction, like the World Wildlife. Oh, we're going to have the panda. It's got to be nice, fuzzy fur ball with nice big round. It's estimated we've only found, located, and identified 35% of all the plants and animals on the planet. They found an animal the size of a small cow in the Vietnam forest about 4 years ago, and they had a war there. But think about the extinction thing. Let me tell you, there are a lot of animals that are doing very well, thank you very much. Pigeons, seagulls, coyotes, snakes. Have I mentioned any you like yet? Oh, you see, it's very emotional thing. You know, you've got to have those nice white. Greenpeace decided they were going to defend the seals. The Newfoundlanders, with their wonderful sense of humor, they said, we are going to protect the cod because the seals are killing the cod. So they formed a group called Codpeace. And this is looking at the last 1,000 years of European temperatures. Here's the current temperature, and going back, you can see to the Little Ice Age, around 1680, the nadir of temperatures then. But if I tell you that in 1704 they had ice on the Mediterranean in the south of France, you start to understand how cold it was. Then you've got this medieval optimum, this very warm period around 1,000 years ago. That had significant effect in North America here. And they consider 12th century the optimum century in Scottish history. Why? Because it was warm and they could grow crops. They were able to grow lots of food, and that left lots of time when they could build Gothic cathedrals. They had the manpower, the people that were available to do it because somebody was producing enough food. This is the most recent temperature of the world. And what it shows is from 1979, the temperature is going up. And then, of course, since 1998, it's changed. And, of course, when it was going up, they called that global warming. And then from 1998 onwards, they had a problem because Mother Nature wasn't going along with what they were forecasting. And so instead of going back and saying, our science is wrong, they called it climate change. Right? People were starting to make jokes about, oh, you know, where's that global warming? Right? I like to tell people it's another undelivered government promise. This Swedish alarmist, Bo Yellen, he said, I agree with Nick that climate change might be a better labeling than global warming. And so you start to see what's going on. That their global warming scare, the evidence, this, by the way, their hypothesis was CO2 goes up, the temperature will go up. Well, the CO2 was continuing to go up, but the temperature wasn't going up anymore. And here's the graph. Taking that from 1998 on, you can see the temperature declining slightly. Look what the CO2 is going. It's not supposed to happen. Well, they try to come up with all kinds of excuses about what's wrong. Oh, it's in the deep ocean and all the rest of it. The problem is their computer models are wrong. They don't work. Every prediction they've made using these computer models has been wrong. I mean, every single one. This is how the computer models are created. They divide the world up into grids. And the smallest grids are like this one is 3 degrees latitude by 3 degrees longitude. That's a large area. But here's the problem. 85% of the world, we have no weather stations. 70% of the oceans, virtually no weather stations. 20% of the land is mountains. 19% is desert. No weather stations. Most of the weather stations are concentrated in eastern North America and western Europe. What are they building these models on? And the answer is, they create a model for each grid, and they guess at what the temperature might be in that grid. Because this is the point they've reached because they haven't got the data. They create a computer model that tells them, oh, here's the data. They take that then as real data and put it into another computer when it isn't real data. That's how corrupted this has become. You think we haven't got any data on the surface. When you get above the surface, we've got even less. The inability to forecast. Well, here's those graphs of temperature and the change from warming to climate change. This is the surface temperature. This is the satellite leveling off. This is their forecasts. But you see, after 1990, their forecasts were so wrong, they changed the name again. They stopped saying we're doing predictions, we're doing projection, all right? And so they came up with, they brought a low projection, a best projection, and a high projection. Even the low projections are wrong. Would you buy anything from anybody that was wrong with every previous forecast they've told you? Look how bad we are. Keep sending the check. I want to show you this quote. This is from a person who was a meteorologist and physicist. His name's Klaus Eckhart Plus. And this is what he said. 10 years ago, I simply parroted what the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, told us. One day, I started checking the facts and data. First, I started with a sense of doubt. But then I became outraged when I discovered that much of what the IPCC and the media were telling us was sheer nonsense, was not even supported by any scientific facts and measurements. To this day, I still feel shame that as a scientist, I made presentations of their science without first checking it. Scientifically, it is sheer absurdity to think you can get a nice climate by turning a CO2 adjustment knob, because it contradicts everything that you're being told. But what are they exploiting? They're exploiting your lack of knowledge, and I've already shown you some things that most of you weren't aware of. And one of the things they tell you is, oh, there's going to be more severe weather. We're having more severe weather. They want to play on the perception people have. Because it seems like every time you turn on the TV, oh, here's another severe weather event. So what's happening now is the media have decided, they don't have just a weather report, it's extreme weather. You think, oh, I've watched so many severe weather events, it's got to be true. But here's a plot of tropical storms and hurricanes from 1971 to the present. Show me the increase. Do you know the year when most people died from tornadoes in the US? 1905. 250 people died. And there weren't that many people living in Tornado Alley at that time. Here's another example of how they exploit it. This is the US tornadoes from 1950 to 2007. You say, well, there it is. Oh yeah, tornadoes increasing. But let's look at the facts. Population growth has resulted in more tornadoes being reported. Environment Canada is not allowed to say that there was a tornado unless somebody saw it. So you got more people, they're going to see more tornadoes. Advances in weather radar, particularly the deployment of about 100 Doppler radars across the US in the mid-90s, has resulted in a much higher tornado detection rate. So suddenly when you start to look at and explain this data, you see that that increase probably doesn't exist at all. Do you know who made one of the most honest statements recently? Believe it or not, was Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett's very heavily invested in insurance. And he said, I've been looking at our records and we've got no increase in claims for quite some time. And what's significant about that? Who would benefit more by saying, oh, it's terrible, you buy more insurance? than the guy that owns the insurance company. Here you've got, this is the U.S. annual count of strong to violent tornadoes, 1954 through 2012. There's no increase. But this is one of the most interesting ones for you to understand, because what do they tell you? Oh, the Arctic ice is melting, the polar bears are dying, and all of this. Again, looking down on the North Pole, this is for April of 2013, and it shows approximately 15 million square kilometers of ice is the red. And then this is the same diagram by September of that year, and there's the Arctic ice by September. That every single year, 10 million square kilometers of ice melt every year. In other words, an area the size of the continental US. That is normal. Normal. But how many people are aware of this? The answer is virtually nobody. And that's why they chose these things, because they know you don't know. And let's put that in some perspective. That means that it melts in approximately 150 days. So that's 25,900 square miles a day. That's normal. I'd love to see a headline in USA Today that says, an area equal to West Virginia melted today, because that's what happens. That's normal. But let me show you how they play the game. A few years ago, they said, oh, more ice melted in the Arctic this year than last year. An area the size of Texas. Oh, that's so big, Texas. Oh, my. But of course, you see, when you say, well, what's the area of Texas as a function of the continental US, it's about 4%. So it's not significant at all. But the use of the term and the idea of people's minds, then it becomes a harem-scarum thing. Because you see, you hear about the polar bears drowning, and this was a photograph that Al Gore used in his movie. The woman who took this picture was on a tourist ship in the Arctic. And she said the polar bears weren't threatened, they weren't drowning, nothing. In fact, they climbed up on this ice to see what was on the ship, and they saw food. They are superb swimmers. In the search and rescue we did in the Arctic, I've seen polar bears 100 miles offshore. Why do they swim so well? Because their long fur is hollow. And it's hollow because it transmits sunlight down into the body to keep the body warm. Because it's hollow, of course, it floats. Next time you see a polar bear in the water, you'll see all that fur up. And of course, it just paddles away happily looking for food. But one of the things about the polar bear is it only appeared in the Arctic about 100,000 years ago. In biologic terms, that's yesterday. It is actually a modified version of the Alaska brown bear. And because it so recently arrived in the Arctic and modified to a white fur, you find hybrid polar bears. And of course, the Alaska brown bear lives on land. Polar bears live on land very well, thank you very much. That's how they survived that warm period I showed you when the ice was melting. Mitch Taylor, Nunavut government biologist, observed in the front page story in the Nutskiat News, the Inuit were right. There aren't just a few more bears, there are a hell of a lot more bears. So all of that nonsense about the polar bears disappearing is just that. What's the motive? This is a guy by the name of Robert Malthus. He was the son of an aristocrat, and of course he was the third son, so he had to go into the church. Malthus got interested in population, and he wrote a book called An Essay on the Principles of Population. Darwin took this book with him on the Beagle when he went on his famous voyage of discovery of evolution. You know what Malthus's view was? There are too many people. We got to reduce the number of people. And the governments are not helping because the governments are giving out money to the poor. They're helping those people that shouldn't be having children. Malthus was really a eugenicist. Got to reduce the population. And what he argued was that the population would outgrow the food supply. That idea got picked up by this guy, Paul Ehrlich, at Stanford University. And he wrote a book called The Population Bomb. And here you see some of his predictions. The battle to feed humanity is over. In the 1970s, the world will undergo famines. Hundreds of millions of people are going to starve, including Americans. I think you got the other end of the problem, don't you? I wouldn't be a judgmental Canadian and make any comment about that. Smog disasters, 1973, might kill 200,000 people in New York and Los Angeles. I would take even money that England will not exist in the year 2000. This guy's still teaching at the university. I mean, it's unbelievable that you can be that wrong. And then he said, before 1985, mankind will enter a genuine age of scarcity in which the accessible supplies of many key minerals will be facing depletion. An economist by the name of Julian Simon took a bet with him. And he said, I'll bet you pick any minerals and you pick any time period, and I'll bet you by the end of it, there'll be more minerals at a lower price. And Ehrlich took the bet. but he hired somebody to pick the minerals in the time period. And he picked this guy, John Holdren, who is now Obama's science czar. And Holdren wrote a book with Paul Ehrlich called Ecoscience, Population, Resources, Environment. And here's one of the things he says in the book. Indeed, it has been concluded that compulsory population control laws, even including laws requiring compulsory abortion, could be sustained under the existing Constitution. But here's the game. Here's the game. Many years ago, H.L. Mencken said that the urge to save the planet is almost always a false front for the urge to rule. And in order to justify doing what under normal circumstances people would say, you can't do that. Forced abortions? What kind of a state do you think we're living in? But look what he says. If the population crisis became sufficiently severe to endanger society, oh, we're doing this for the greater good. Oh, we're taking over your land for the greater good. We're taking over your water resources for the greater good. We're saving the planet. You don't care about the planet or the children? What kind of a monster are you? See, that's the moral high ground they take. That's the way it's played. Holdren, by the way, was a promoter of eugenics, the idea that you select certain people. And then that got put into the Club of Rome, which was founded by David Rockefeller in 1961. And these guys, King and Schneider, said the common enemy of humanity is man. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming. See, they needed something that was going to impact the whole Earth. Because then they could say, hey, individual nations aren't capable of dealing with it. It's got to be one world government. That's the only way we can handle this. That's the game that's going on here. But here's the interesting thing. This goes back to about early 60s at least. This is called the demographic transition model. What it shows is that as your economy improves, your population declines. Why did people have a lot of children in the old days? Because that was their pension plan. And they had lots of children because if 3 out of 10 survived, you were lucky. The average woman in the 17th century had 23 confinements, that is 23 pregnancies. If you allow economic development, the population goes down. And in fact, in those countries that are not allowing immigration, they've got serious problems. You normally need 2.6 children per family. Okay, I was the 0.6 in my family. But if you have below 2.6 children per family, then your population rate's going to decline. Japan is about 1.3. And what they've got now is an aging population because people are living longer and in better health, and you've got a smaller and smaller young people to support that. When you allow proper development, American population generally, the birth rate's going down. So this demographic transition actually is the solution. So you allow development, you don't block development. This is Maurice Strong, a Canadian. It was interviewed, and he said, isn't the only hope for the planet the industrialized nations collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? He's a member of the Club of Rome, and he started all of this. He took it from the Club of Rome and put it into the United Nations. How would you bring about the end of the industrialized nations? If you think about the industrialized nation driven by fossil fuel like the engine of a car, you can stop the engine of the car by squeezing off the fuel line. But if you do that, people scream right away. You've experienced that. The price of gasoline goes up, everybody's in a riot. But you can also stop the engine by plugging the exhaust. So if you could tell people, hey, the exhaust from your engine or your industrialized nation is causing runaway global warming, and what is the exhaust from that fossil fuel engine? CO2. So now we come full cycle around, why did they choose CO2? Because it wanted to fulfill this. Got to shut down the industrialized nations. And if you want to see the effects of what happens when you institute those policies, in the same year, he chaired the Rio Summit in 1992. He became the head of Ontario Hydro, which is the public utility in Ontario, Canada, that controls all energy in that province. And he shut down the nuclear plants, he shut down the coal plants, and he built wind turbines. And ever since, Ontarians have been paying a surcharge on their electricity bill. And they'll be paying it for 40 years as they attempt to catch up with the damage that he did. But he wants that for the whole world. Elaine Dewar, who interviewed him for her book, said, well, that's a good idea, why don't you run for politics? He said, you can't do anything as a politician. I'm going to the United Nations where I can get all the money I want, not be accountable to anybody. Well, do you know where he is now? He's hiding out in China. Do you know why he's hiding out in China? Because the US government want him for fraud. Because he and his son, Kofi Annan, who was the head of the United Nations, and his son, made millions of dollars off of that food for oil in Iraq scam. And I spoke to Elaine 5 years ago, said you should redo the book. She said, I got hate mail, I got death threats, I wouldn't go near it. Worst thing I ever did. She said Strong was using the United Nations as a platform to sell a global environment crisis and the global governance agenda. In the United States, this is Senator Tim Wirth. He was the guy that put this on the political table because he wanted a scientist that would say that humans were causing the global warming. And he found a guy by the name of James Hansen who was working for NASA, and Hansen said, yeah, I'll come before your committee and I'll say that. He was rewarded by being made head of NASA GIS for the rest of his career. But what happened with Wirth? He said, well, we got to get this Hansen to appear before a Senate committee. And so they set it up. They figured out which was the hottest day of the year in Washington from the record. And they said, okay, that's the day we'll have the we'll have Hansen in to talk about global warming and the heat, the runaway heat. But the night before, they went into the Senate and they opened the windows and shut off the air conditioning. So the whole thing was held in sweltering heat. And of course, what better ambiance to make your argument about global warming? Well, guess where he's working now? Gave up a nice Senate seat. He's now with the United Nations. We'll go through this fairly quickly, but here's Maurice Strong, the political United Nations in Rio in 1992. They set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to create the science that they needed to prove their political point, to focus on CO2. How did they do that? And I just want to very quickly, the first commission I got appointed to, boy, was I rudely disabused. I was appointed to be on a commission investigating lake levels in a large lake in Canada. We then got the terms of reference from the government for our investigation. They were so narrow that they literally determined what the outcome of our report would be. And I said to the chairman of the commission, Mr. Duncan, I said, you go to the minister and tell him, unless we get full access to all data and all information, I'm going to go to the media and say, you're trying to predetermine the outcome of it. Well, we got all the information. And guess what? I found out there have been 4 previous commissions of inquiry, all identifying the problem, all recommending changes. None of them ever acted on. It's in those terms of reference that they control the commission of inquiry. Well, here's how they controlled the climate thing. By the definition, they were told to look at a change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere, which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over considerable time. In other words, only look at human causes. Don't look at what nature's doing. You can't possibly determine this if you don't know what nature's doing. It's impossible. So the IPCC were very restricted right from the start to only looking at human causes. And of course that narrows it to CO2. So here they did the science report, and from the science report they say, yeah, oh yeah, CO2 is causing it, we're 95% certain. So then the second group say, okay, it's humans causing the warming, so we'll look at the impacts. And these guys say, oh, you know, the polar bear is going to die, this is going to happen, all the negative things, that's all you hear in the media. They never look at the positive sides of warming. You know, there's Canadians up there saying, come on, warming. It's like an economist doing a cost-benefit study and only looking at the cost. It's exactly what's going on here. Then they corrupt it even more, because here's the science report, and then once all of this is finished, they keep that, they don't disclose that, they produce a summary report. And the summary report doesn't agree with what the science report says at all, because it's produced by different people. And it's released to the public with all the scares and all of the false claims. And then they release this, and then this goes back to the scientists saying, make sure that your science report agrees with what we told the public. This is like an executive doing a study of his company and then saying to the employees, make sure you find evidence to support the conclusions I've already reached. And the other thing that's driving so much of this, of course, is the funding. This is the cartoon. This is Dr. Bagshaw, discovery of the infinitely expanding research grant. Let's look at the data. This is NASA GIS. The number of stations starting in before 1900 reached a peak in 1960. They've been closing weather stations ever since. One of the reasons they argued was because of the satellites. But the satellites can't see through cloud. It can't tell you whether it rained or snowed or whether any precipitation fell at all. They reduced the number of stations, but they selected only stations that showed significant warming. And so here's the number of stations declining, and then the drop in 1990, but look what happened to global temperatures. And let me show you how bad that was. Here's Canada. These diamonds are the only stations that they use to determine Canada's average temperature. Look at the Arctic. This whole Arctic archipelago which is larger than the continental US. They got one station for the whole of the Canadian Arctic. And I know Eureka, and I've been in there, and I've done studies with people. It's a uniquely warm spot in the Arctic. That's why they chose it. There are plants there that survived the last ice age. There's a lawsuit that I've been part of in New Zealand, because what every government in the world has been doing is been lowering the historic record to make the slope of the temperature increase look greater than it actually is. This is for Auckland Airport. The blue line is the actual readings. The red line is the government adjusted readings. And here you can see what they've done for the whole of New Zealand. They've done that for every single country, every record in the world. And when we brought the lawsuit against the New Zealand government said, oh yeah, we'll go to court over it. And then a week before we were going to go to court, they said, oh no, we won't go to court. We'll have a commission of inquiry. Oh yeah. And who did they choose to do the commission of inquiry? The Australian Weather Bureau, who were doing exactly the same thing. I just got one record here. This is Ruth Glen. Here's the actual original, and here's the adjusted record. They've all been doing it. So they can claim that the temperature's gone up much more than actually happened. And I hope I'm not going on too long, but it's such a long story. And I'm very aware that the mind can absorb what the behind can endure. But this is one of the first bits of corruption. This is an upper atmosphere temperature record from 1955 to 1995. That's the actual record. Here's what went into their report. They selected, this was done by Benjamin Santer, the lead author, so they selected this portion which showed an increase. They said, oh, there it is. It's warming. But look at the original record. I mean, this is so corrupt that you don't know where to start talking about it. This is what they agreed to go into the report. All the scientists agreed. None of the studies cited above have shown clear evidence that we can attribute the observed causes to the specific cause of increased greenhouse gases. While some of the pattern-based discussed here have claimed detection of a significant climate change, no study to date has positively attributed all or part of climate change to man-made causes. Any claim of positive detection or attribution of significant change are likely to remain controversial until certainties in the total natural variability of the system. That's what they were going to put into the report. All of the scientists combined. Santer went off on his own, and when he submitted the report and it came out, this is what he put in there. There is evidence of an emerging pattern of climate response to forcing by greenhouse gases. Completely contradicts this. And he said, the body of statistical evidence in Chapter 8, when examined in the context of our physical understanding of the climate system, now points to a discernible human influence on the global climate. But these guys said there was no evidence of that. But guess what the media picked up on? A discernible human influence. That became the headline in the New York Times. Just absolutely amazing. But we go back to this graph that I showed you earlier. This is the 1,000 years, the warming of the medieval optimum, this medieval warm period. This graph created a great problem for them, because it appeared in the first report in 1990. Here they were saying this is as warm as it's ever been, and people like me were saying, well, what about the medieval warm period? It was warmer 1,000 years ago. We had all this evidence to support that. This is testimony from David Deming, who I've known for 30 years. This is his testimony to the US Congress, so it's given under oath. And he said, with the publication of the article in Science, I gained significant credibility in the community of scientists working on climate change. They thought I was one of them, someone who would pervert science in the service of social and political causes. So one of them let his guard down. A major person working in the area of climate change and global warming sent me an astonishing email that said, we have to get rid of the medieval warm period. We have to rewrite history. And that's what they did. And they produced this graph, infamously called the hockey stick. The person that produced this is Michael Mann, is at Penn State. He is now suing me. I have a large lawsuit against me by him because I showed how they corrupted the data and what they'd done. And the interviewer said, what do you think about Mr. Mann? And I flippantly said, he's at Penn State, but he should be at State Penn. No sense of humor. And of course, by the way, in Canada, no protection of free speech. That's why the lawsuit was filed in Canada. I would never have had the lawsuit here in the US. But what Michael Mann did was he used tree rings to produce this decline in temperature. You see the medieval warm period's gone. What's the mistake with this? Tree rings don't show temperature. They're precipitation driven. And he only selected one tree ring set which showed the declining temperature. But then they had a problem because the temperature on the tree rings kept going down into the 20th century. So what they did was they cut it off at 1900 and they tacked on modern instrumental record, which is completely scientifically corrupt. And what we got from the leaked emails, what they were doing. They instructed the computer to hide the decline. That, oh, we can't have that decline, so we've got to hide it. So whenever the thing starts to go down, plug in this data and that'll make it go back up again. And two Canadians by the name of McIntyre and McKittrick reconstructed some of the data, and of course there the medieval warm period shows up again, and here you can see. But look at this blade of the hockey stick. That's instrumental record. This was produced by Phil Jones at the University of East Anglia, who was heavily involved in this corruption. And he claimed the global average surface temperature increased by 0.6 to plus or minus 0.2 in the late 19th century. So the temperature went up 0.6 degrees in about 120 years. That's what he claimed. But look at this. 0.6 degrees plus or minus 0.2. This is a range of error of plus or minus 33%. And when the Australian climatologist sent an email to Jones and said, he asked for the data. He said, show us the data. How did you get this blade of the hockey stick? And this is what Jones replied. We have 25 years or so invested in the work. Why should I make the data available to you when your aim is to try and find something wrong with it? I mean, people don't believe that this is going on amongst world-class scientists. That's the problem. And by the way, and in the leaked emails, Jones is saying, I hope they don't find out that they can get the data through freedom of information. And so they found different ways to hide the data. Finally, they got pushed hard enough, and oh, lo and behold, Mr. Jones lost his data. He lost his data, okay? And Michael Mann, of course, is now refusing to disclose his calculations of how he made the hockey stick. Very quickly at the end here, omissions. In the computer models, they leave out so much because they're only looking at human causes. I don't know how many in the room know this. This is called the Milankovitch effect. We've known about it since 1863, or most of it. The orbit of the Earth around the Sun changes from almost circular to extreme ellipse. That's going on all the time, a constant changing, caused by the gravitational pull of the planet Jupiter. The tilt of the Earth is constantly changing from 24.5 to 21.9. We tell everybody it's 23.5 degrees, but that's just close enough for government work. Change the tilt by 1 degree and think what happens to the latitudes of, the Arctic Circle, Antarctic Circle, the tropics. The whole distribution of energy changes. And then what's called the precession of the equinox, the day on which the days and nights are equal length, is constantly changing. And you want proof of that? We have to keep upgrading our calendars because they're fixed and nature isn't. The government of Britain in 1752 ordered to add 11 days to the calendar. Okay? There were riots in Britain. People died in the riots in Britain, and because people thought the government had shortened their lives by 11 days. Incidentally, I was teaching a course and I was talking about this in a penitentiary in Canada because I wanted to have a captive audience for a change. And I was telling them about how this year got shortened by 11 days, and I said everybody was angry, and one of the prisoners said, I know a group that weren't. All of these changes are going on all of the time. They're not included in their computer model because they say, oh, these are long-term changes. No, every single year the tilt's changing, every single year the orbit's changing. And you're telling me this is a forecast for 100 years. This is significant, but they don't include it. And they don't include this. They don't include the fact that cosmic radiation from the sun, the amount reaching the Earth, is determined by the strength of the sun's magnetic field. And so as the sun's magnetic field strength changes, cosmic radiation reaching the lower atmosphere determines the amount of cloud cover on the Earth. So it's like putting up a screen in the greenhouse. I'll show you just this one graph. The blue is the low cloud cover, and here's the cosmic radiation variation. None of this is included in their computer models, yet we've known about it since 1991. These are major, major causes of controls of climate change, not included in their computer models. We've known for decades about sunspot numbers. Remember I showed you that little ice age? This is called the Great Frost. Now, the last time that you had ice of any significance on the Thames was in 1836. The correlation between sunspot numbers and global temperature is, of course, because of the cloud cover and the sun's magnetic radiation. None of this is included in their climate models. The current situation is, here's cycle 23, 2010. We're down to sunspot numbers this year comparable to around 1800. And so, of course, the Earth is cooling down. Will continue to cool down because the sunspot numbers are declining, solar activity is declining. And we're expecting that to cool to at least till 2037. But what's the government doing? Preparing you for warming. Exactly the wrong direction. They're better to do nothing. These are two cavemen. It says something's just not right. Our air is clean, our water is pure, we all get plenty of exercise, everything we eat is organic and free range, and yet nobody lives past 30. A lot of people want to go back to these conditions. I can tell you, having talked with Aboriginal people all across Canada, the elders, they say, "You're crazy." The good old times. But I hope I've given you a brief insight there. I mean, there are so many other stories of corruption and misdirection, but at least it gives you an idea of why I talk about the deliberate corruption of science, because that's what it is. It's premeditated. And just like with murders of passion are one thing, but premeditated murders are a completely different situation. So for that, I thank you for inviting me, and I thank you for your attention.
If you have a question, please come up here and...
Good evening, Dr. Ball. Thank you for coming and enlightening us. On what basis, if any, are you ever attacked on weaknesses in your science by your colleagues?
I've worked in government, I've been in the military, and I've worked in private industry. Politics in academia is absolutely the most vicious anywhere. It really is nasty. In fact, I joked about I took early retirement because there was so much scar tissue on my back, there was nowhere to put a knife anymore. The lawsuits that I've had are from, well, three of them were from academics, one from a bureaucrat, and all filed through the same lawyer in Vancouver. And I've had death threats. I'm not particularly proud of that. And I didn't want to tell people about that because we talk about ethics. Many scientists are afraid to speak out. We had one just recently, Bengtsson, a Swedish scientist who declared, he joined a global warming policy foundation group, which is skeptics, and he just got hate mail. He said, "I don't need this. I don't want these sorts of attacks." So there are many scientists that won't speak out. You get scientists who tell me that, oh, they're socialists, and if they agree with the position I'm presenting, they're immediately classified as conservative or right wing, and they don't want to be classified as conservative or right wing. The scientific method requires that you be a skeptic. That the scientific method says you create a hypothesis, then other scientists challenge it. But what happened with the global warming hypothesis was, as Richard Lindzen from MIT said, it became consensus immediately. And anybody that dared to attack it was marginalized as a global warming skeptic. And I try to point out to people, no, I'm not saying that global warming hasn't occurred. All I'm saying is humans aren't the cause of it. And then when it changed to climate change, of course, the names against me changed. I became called a climate change denier, with all of the Holocaust connotations of that word. And I was first called a climate change denier on the Times of London front page. I have to mention that because, you know, I just telling the Queen last week how much I hate name droppers. But you know, as I said, the word denier is deliberate with the Holocaust connotations attached to it. In the long term, for me, the damage this is doing to science and to the environmental issue, as I said, the credibility of science. And I quite seriously think if I was to go back and do it again, I wouldn't do it. It is that nasty. My biggest concern has been the damage to my family or attacks on my family. Fortunately, that hasn't happened yet, but also, of course, in terms of loss of income, because I never received any research grants, even though I've been accused of getting money from the oil companies and everything else. After we'd spent all our savings on lawyers, then we got a website and money came in from around the world to help. My legal bills have run to $300,000 already. But I had people actually sending me money saying, look, we don't totally agree with you, but we defend your right to say it.
The journals as well have been corrupted.
But also what happened was that some of the editors of the journals were in bed with these climate scientists, because one of the things that they did to marginalize people like me was they'd say, oh, well, he's not got many peer-reviewed articles. Well, what they were doing was they were peer-reviewing each other's articles. And they were picking out, well, you can be an author on this article. And they were deciding whose names would go on, because then that padded their publication list. I mean, the corruption went within all of this publication and peer review. It made a mockery of the peer review. That hockey stick thing, which I never got to see it, but if I'd have seen it, I'd know what was wrong with it. But it was peer reviewed. But who was it peer reviewed by? His buddies that were in the same game. And the journals went along with that. Nature particularly was bad. So there was corruption all throughout. And it was for the two things. It was the funding and it was the political agenda.
From all my readings of the tea leaves, it seems like sea level rise is the best indicator of global warming. How accurate is that statement scientifically?
The sea level question is not very accurate at all, partly because sea isn't level.
It varies around the globe.
It varies around the globe. And for example, if you go through the Panama Canal, the sea level is different on one side than the other. And you say, how can that be? They're connected around the bottom of South America. But you don't know. You've got to shift gears to get up into the Atlantic. And you get, because of the gravitational strength in the Earth's crust, will cause bulges in the surface of the ocean. We knew a lot about this when we were doing anti-submarine work, because we're flying very close and we needed to know how the sea levels vary. Sea level varies also with the atmospheric pressure. Because when you get a hurricane, for example, the pressure is so low that the sea actually rises up. And that intensifies the problem of a hurricane, because that bulge, which is a very long wave, moves along with the hurricane. Now, if that comes on shore at high tide and with an onshore wind, then the storm surge is going to be much greater, and that's what happened with Katrina. Now they claim with satellites that they can measure sea level, but how can you do that? The oceans are not smooth and flat. And we've also got some interesting measures. There's one in Australia where they marked the sea level back in, I think it was 1870 or something, and the sea level's lower now in that region. But as I mentioned when I was talking, if you're on the shore, you don't know whether the sea level is going up and down or the land level is going up and down.
So the new threat on the environment is ocean acidification.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Okay, ocean acidification, which is of course being pushed very strongly here in your state. The term ocean acidification is wrong scientifically. The oceans are alkaline. They're becoming less alkaline, not becoming more acidified. The average for the oceans is about 9, but the variation in ocean alkaline levels varies tremendously around the world. So this is another one of the things that they're trying to argue, that the CO2, more CO2 is absorbed into the oceans, and therefore that changes the acidity. It's just simply, it's simply not true. It's just another of the scares. What can you do about it? They get the headline, they never follow up on the other side of the story, and that's the difficulty. The next issue is going to be water. Because in that list I showed you, the Club of Rome, they list water shortages. There's no shortage of water in the world, none whatsoever. There's variations in the availability of water, distribution is unequal, but there really is no water shortage, but they want to make that the next issue. And in fact, if you go to your Google, you Google peak water, they're already talking about peak water. And in fact, it was a Professor Gleick from where else? Stanford, who is pushing this idea, in fact created the term peak water, And it suggests that the world's reaching its peak of water and then we're going to run out of it. And again, it's absolute harem-scarum nonsense.
I wanted just to kind of ask, maybe it's kind of one of the closing questions, but what do you see as the end game? I have a feeling that, in your mind, you can see where this all may be heading, what the cure might be.
Well, the motive, of course, was implied in that comment by Maurice Strong. They want one world government. Nationalism and individual nations simply have got to disappear. And that's why they wanted something that was global in its threat and argued that no one government could manage it. In 2009, there was a conference was supposed to be held in Copenhagen. It was held, actually, in Copenhagen, at which they were going to finalize the carbon tax for the world. That was going to fund all of this one world government. And it was going to be done through the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which of course is another of these great overarching, unaccountable bureaucracies. And these people really believe that only they can run the world. But that's the agenda. They want one world government. They want to get rid of national governments and individualism. But of course that's also going on within every country. It's the suppression of the individual to the greater good. And they'll use whatever vehicle that they claim you're threatening or will bring about the end of the world or the end of the nation as a vehicle to control you. So that's really what's happening. So just leave me alone, eh? But that, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Anyway, Professor Ball, it's been a delight. I really enjoyed that. So thank you very much.